Tes.
Mengangkat dulu atau saya computer dulu? Kamu dulu.
Good evening, Professor, fathers, brothers, and sisters. First and foremost, let's express our gratitude to Almighty God for allowing us to gather here today for this important and special event, especially for the coming of Professor James Morris. Before we begin, Professor, I would like to read the CV first for us all. Professor James Morris has taught in Boston College, has taught in Exeter, Princeton, Oberlin, and IELTS. He lectures on Islam thought, Sufism, the Islamic Humanities, poetry, music, and arts, Qur'an and hadith, and spiritual Shiism. His books in press include openings from Qur'an and the Islamic Humanities, Fons Vitae, Approaching Ibn Arabi Foundation Contents, Interpretation, and Ostad Elahi, Exposition, and the Truth, or SUNY. I know you have been through a lot of journey. If Pope Francis also said that it is the longest journey in Indonesia. I know you've been through a longest journey also. And also before we begin, let us hear from Father Bagus as our rector of Sanata Dharma University. To Father Bagus, time and place is yours.
Thank you, Father Billy. Good evening, everyone. I hope you're doing well, and we are very privileged to have Professor James Winston Morris to come here and to deliver the lecture on Sufism to all of us. Professor Morris, I know him from long time ago, but not long time ago in Bethlehem. Long time ago in Boston, when I went to Boston College to begin my doctoral degree in comparative theology. I met Professor Morris, and then I took him as my advisor as well. So I'm also privileged to be here, to be with him in this classroom with all of you. Dan Profesor Morris ini punya banyak pengalaman di dunia Islam. He took me to different places in Turkey, in Anatolia, in different places as well, introducing me to the richness of the Islamic traditions in encounters with or in collaborations or encounters with other religious traditions. Jadi beliau ahli juga Judaism, Islam, Christianity, Orthodoxy. We went to the kami pergi ke tempatnya Paus. Kalau tadi dibicarakan Paus Franciscus, kami ketemu Pausnya Orthodox di Istanbul some years ago. We were meeting with the Patriarch of Istanbul. Saya bersama seorang Yesuit asli Amerika, tapi patriarknya cuek terhadap Yesuit Amerika. Dia lebih tertarik pada Yesuit dari Bantul. I was telling them that the patriarch was quite impressed by the fact that I am a Jesuit coming from Indonesia, an Islamic country. Yesuit dari Indonesia, negara Islam, itu menarik bagi beliau dan kami banyak berbincang-bincang. Indeed, we are grateful for your presence, Professor Morris, and then we are looking forward to having the discussion as well after the lecture. Nanti kalau ada hal-hal yang kurang bisa dipahami, Professor Morris will talk in English more slowly, and Romo Heru dan Romo Joko pun akan membantu. Silahkan disiapkan pertanyaan-pertanyaan untuk memperkaya mata kuliah kajian agama dan dialog ini. Kita bertepuk tangan untuk Profesor Morris. Please, Professor. Okay, you're okay. Right, I will do. Okay. Suaranya jelas, tapi paham nggak kalian? Okay, thank you.
You want me to use this? Does that help? I don't have to talk so loud. Okay, but if I go too fast or if you can't hear me, can you please just raise your hand and get my attention? And that way we'll know. So just to start out, one thing I was curious about, because I'm going to be talking about, you can kind of forget the part at the beginning of the announced title, but talking about shared challenges of communication. Because I think today, no matter where we live in the world, that people who come from and are well formed in a religious tradition are more and more rare compared to people who have, we could call them secular or whatever, but people who have relatively little formal religious formation. So communication here is, I'm talking about things that often relate to Islam, but also are examples that are relevant to people in a Christian tradition. Just for example, this isn't something I'm preparing to talk about, but I'm curious whether in the course of your preparation here for the theological degree, do you have to study people like St. Thomas Aquinas, for example, or is that something for advanced students? And the great Catholic Christian theologians? The professor is nodding, but not the students. Is the question clear? Do you think it's clear? I don't know. I don't know your curriculum, but I would just give, for example, that a lot of people I noticed in Boston College, they would read a lot of scholastic philosophers, whether or not the students were in theology, and often would not realize how closely intertwined Islamic philosophy, the great figures like Ibn Sina, Avicenna in particular, also Averroes, and well, others, but especially Avicenna, are really in a way building foundation stones for the medieval scholastic theologians in the Catholic tradition. And actually, when one looks more closely at the relationships between Islam, or at least Islamic intellectuals and spiritual figures, and Christian, usually Catholic ones in the pre-modern, pre-Reformation era, that there are all of these areas in which, in around the Mediterranean, and including the Holy Land, where there are all sorts of formative interactions between Christian traditions and Muslim traditions at that time. You might get the impression in the modern world that these are kind of hereditary enemies or very different worldviews, but that isn't until the colonial era, and especially as one of the bad influences of colonialism, that people began to react understandably to Western colonizers and to identify Christianity, whether it be Protestant or Catholic, with unwanted colonizers. I think unwanted goes without saying, but perhaps I should also say that part of my interest in this kind of aspect of interreligious dialogue and understanding contact in all of its forms is that when I grew up, I was on a farm. It was from a peasant background, like probably anybody here still grow up from on a farm, a rice farm, or whatever it might be. Again, is my question unclear? There must be some people here who, you know, they're not responding, but because, you know, I think it's quite relevant because when I first came to Indonesia, I've been back several times, but basically wherever I go in the world where people live from farming, as my father did, and I was his farm laborer, so I was intimately involved in the project. Life is so similar, what you have to do, what you have to take care of, what your responsibilities are. And most of the world, until very recently, was people who grew up with that contact with nature. So much of our religious and spiritual life is tied to our relationship to nature, to things like the weather and land and all that we're dependent upon. That certainly formed my understanding of religion and religion issues. And the other thing was that on both my father and mother's side, they told me we were related from Cherokee and Choctaw Indian tribes. I guess, I'm not sure, with the equivalent here being some indigenous peoples of the Eastern Indonesia or the Bugis in Sulawesi or something like that, that a very different religious background and cultural background than the European settlers who came in. And so from very early life, I was always trying to understand religion from something I was raised in, but also something that was a bit not what I identified with, because my identity was that of being Native American. By the way, it may be fictional, it may be mythical, but there are pictures of me when I was a child going around with a headdress, a loincloth, and a couple of feathers in headdress, and either a spear or a bow and arrow. And they would never put shoes on me except to go to church on Sunday. This is when I was visiting in Texas, where my mother was from. So I, from a very early age, I was interested in differences of religion and realized how much that identity of oneself is tied to very different interpretations of what can be the same religious tradition. Now, since what I'm talking about may be too fast or too boring, let me just explain, because we'll get there eventually, but you can have fun just watching one or another of these pictures. And what you have here is a kind of image from, let's see, from Central Asia, Iran in about 1400 to 1500, an image of all the forms of love, of human and divine love around the outside, and of animals and all the creatures. So on the outside of this image, if you look closely, and I think you can see enough of the detail, you'll start to recognize different forms of love and things that, for example, just because we talk in English about people who are tree huggers, well, right there, you can see literally there's a woman who's identified with nature so much that she's literally hugging the tree. It's kind of a coincidence that in English now that people who are very devoted to the green movement and so forth, they call them tree huggers. But we'll come back to that at the end, but it'll entertain you if you're looking at it. And then this imagery as such, not the contents, but the form comes from the imagery that became popular in the poetic traditions in Islam. So that what you have in the inside of the frame, so on the outside, again, all the different forms of love, again, the natural animals, when you look closely. In the inside, this image is of what's often called in the poetic tradition of Islam, the beloved, the divine beloved. It's an imagery that in the book of the Song of Songs, or that's very familiar to you if you know your Bible. Has everybody here read and remember the Song of Songs or the Songs of Solomon? The professors always nod, but I'm asking the students, is that imagery familiar to you? It's a part of the Bible, the Old Testament, that usually when my students at college read the Song of Songs, they say, how did this get into the Bible? Why don't they censor this? Because the imagery is so sensual and so sexual that how can this be biblical? So just again, am I going too fast? Too fast. Okay, well, okay. Anyway, so this image of the divine beloved and the interaction between God and the soul understood as God, what's beloved by God, is in the poetry, and also in this image is this figure in the center. And the figure is made up of primarily, with some mostly 12 different figures of particular human beings. The ones outside are in the dress of the time when the painting was done. And they're men and women, as you can see there. And there are a few women in the center too. But I think for the most part, the images are those of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, maybe Isaac or Ishmael, but the very center image is of an old man with a beard and this son that he's protecting. And so, and then behind these figures back there, it's like the open window in the larger world. You have images of the beauty, sort of a metaphysical map of the world, images of conflict and horror, and images of beauty and harmony. And so that's kind of the metaphysical framework for the whole rest of the picture. We'll come back to that, but my point of bringing these along is to say that in Islam, as in every religious tradition, it's often artists, playwrights, poets, above all, who are the real instruments who bring alive the religious tradition and make it, and musicians, I should have added, and make it real for the people who follow that religion. Most of us, when we think of, we'll talk some of the examples later, and we don't realize that religions are always borrowing effective tools, effective instruments for communication from other traditions. The borrowing goes in all directions, but I'll talk a little bit more about this because as we go along with the talk. Now, to come back to the beginning and to the title, the challenges that are shared by different religions today, and I'll talk about Islam, but they will have the parallels to dilemmas facing Christians and Catholics will be, I hope, obvious as we go along. The first thing I wanted to say, why bother? Why bother? Is this just an entertainment session? Well, one reason that I think this is important, whether you be a seminarian or just someone who's identifies as Christian or identifies as Muslim, it's when you study another religious tradition that you actually, for the first time, begin to appreciate parts of your own religious tradition that you took for granted beforehand. For example, where I've taught at different places, BC and before, there were often many Jewish students. For the most part, they were secular traditions. I never had somebody who was an Orthodox Jew, but they had almost no appreciation in general of Judaism as a religious tradition. But when they would study Islam and Sufism and all, they would, and actually very often I would be teaching about Islam, Christianity, and Islam. But even if I was just teaching them about Islam, what they began to see was that they would get very interested in Sufism, mystical art and poetry and so forth in Islam. And by the time they finished the course, they would be, wow, we have all this stuff in Judaism, but we didn't know or we didn't appreciate what we had, that they had to study another tradition in order to really deeply appreciate the riches of their own tradition. And I mentioned that, but the same applies to, say, people from Christian backgrounds studying things that are parallel in the Islamic tradition, how much both Islamic and Christian traditions share with their Abrahamic, their roots in the Abrahamic tradition and in Judaism. So this is what I hope. It's just something that will help you to appreciate and sometimes even to be able to use more deeply your own Christian training and background because you can see how it's being used in what you think of as a different tradition, but it actually is just something that isn't entirely alien to your own. The second issue I would like to raise up, where people in each religious tradition have to learn from each other, is that there are new religious encounters used to be something previously that were usually of two kinds, either between ordinary people in their everyday life, and they weren't really religious, just they were just people from different religious backgrounds having to live together and work together. But the other one were official religious spokespeople and experts and all who would meet in dialogues, as they do today, and learned encounters. But today, most of what we have is encounters, both religions, between, you might say, the secular background is the common framework for religious life, even in Indonesia, and certainly in much of the rest of the world, so that the paradigmatic religious encounters that we all have to deal with, and which you will have to deal with as priests or religious personnel, teachers in different parts of Indonesia, will be again, what's the importance of all this in relation to the secular world in which your students and your parishioners are living. So this is an encounter that Muslims in Indonesia and Christians in Indonesia both have to deal with, is how do you explain your tradition to people who aren't from another tradition, not from Muslim tradition, not from any other, but are just, if you will, what they call nowadays nuns, none of the above, who aren't identified with the historical tradition. So we'll come back to that in some ways, that particular encounter. And then the next thing I would like to mention is just that it's through creativity, through discovering the spiritual dimensions of different arts, and which are always out there in any culture, the different arts and their forms, that through those different arts, we discover spaces for religious dialogue and religious understanding. And what I mean by that is, at a more practical level, is if you have to compare, let's see, you probably already have had to do with family members or with people from your religious community and in the home communities from which you came. You have two options if you want to talk about what Christianity means to you. There's the learned option, where you talk about theologies and theological traditions. And then there's the way of talking about them in terms of images drawn from the culture of people today. Actually, most of what got me interested in this was having 4 children. And a lot of that time that I had them was living in France, very alien culture to them. And so I had to face this issue, which you will have to face, of how do you talk about religious life? They went to Catholic school there. My wife is Catholic. But how do you talk about the meaning of religious life in a world where people will go to church, or they'll go to a school, or they go to the mosque, but apart from maybe some political allegiances, the deeper meaning of what they're seeing and experience there is, for a lot of people, it's just something they practice, but they don't really understand why they're practicing or what they get from it. If I can take an example of all my interest in the Islamic humanities, and let's mention some of them, this would include things like film, especially today, cinema, music, especially spiritual music, visual arts and architecture, plays like the wayang tradition here. And that's enough. Those are, when I talk about the humanities, I'm talking about these different artistic areas of creation that every culture has, and they have old parts and new. Well, what got me interested in this was something very simple. I had been trained in Islamic philosophy and theology, and I was working for a prince who was trying to set up an Islamic university. But what really got me interested in this other dimension of Islam that they didn't do much with in school was going to a place called Chartres. There's a Chartres Cathedral, and its beautiful stained glass windows. As everyone here, if you haven't seen Chartres, I think it could be Reims or Rennes or Cologne, any of the great Gothic cathedrals. Have you run across pictures of the stained glass windows that all tell the stories of the Bible and so forth? Again, I see professors nodding, but not students. So I wonder, is this, if you see even one of those stained glass windows, these beautiful ones, you realize that the cathedral is this image of life on earth, where the light that comes into the cathedral lights up through these windows all the forms of the stories of the Bible and the Gospels and so forth. It lights them up and illuminates them and brings them into the life of the worshipers, the pilgrims, using these cathedrals for sites of pilgrimage, and sort of is like the earthly, it's like the divine archetype, the divine meaning of these stories in the Gospels and in the Bible is brought to life through these windows in the lives of the poor peasants and pilgrims and all who are coming to the church to complete their pilgrimage, to complete their worship. Another thing that I can say, something else that you'll find in these, as this kind of image in the Christian art of that period, is labyrinths in all the great cathedrals. When you come first into the cathedral, you have to pass through, before you can get to the sanctuary, you have to pass through a labyrinth, which is an image of our life on earth and all of the challenges and all the insights and all the meaningful experiences that we encounter. Again, can I ask, have you all seen, or maybe been, some churches have these today, they copy the ones from Chartres and us. You're nodding. Somebody over there was nodding. So you've seen it then. Labyrinths, like the labyrinth of Chartres. Okay, so because if you for somebody who came from America, where religion is kind of far off and very politicized often, and kind of very social, socio-political. It was a great discovery for me to go to Europe and live in this Catholic culture, which was very alive to the influence of the arts and the imagery of the arts in communicating spiritual reality, or in helping us to mirror back our own spiritual experience. The same thing happens, as we'll see, with Islamic humanities. Let me just say that in many ways, much more useful in terms of understanding people's lives in another religious tradition are things like music. Let me just take an example here of the Festival of Sacred Music in Fez in Morocco. This was founded by some Sufi friends I know, actually, who wanted to bring the traditions of dhikr or zikr. Is that what you say in Indonesian? Zikr, how do you say it? Zikr, okay, who wanted to bring those musical traditions into the lives and knowledge of people, be they Muslims or Christians or others, who didn't grow up with that. And in doing so, the festival has constantly expanded until now they have religious music each year coming there in June from literally all corners of the world and from traditions great and small. One of the things that that eventually you understand about the ways that spiritual music speaks directly to the soul, you don't have to study and read about it. That's particularly important because it's a reminder that our spiritual life comes direct, it's vertical, it comes directly from us and the divine, and they've mediated through music or stained glass windows or whatever the images are. But that image, that teaching, that experience really comes through very well in music in every religious culture. To take an example that I was particularly struck by, when I would teach about Islam and have films about dhikr, the remembrance of God and musical traditions. Many of my students at one of the colleges where I taught were African American, from African background. And one time we were showing music from Sudan, from a shrine in Sudan. And suddenly everyone in the class perked up because the music of the shrine where people were, is a Qadri Sufi shrine, where people were circumambulating the tomb of the wali there, the saint. The music was like Chicago blues. It was like the blues music in the United States that even the African-American students didn't realize was really Sufi music from their deeper heritage back in the Sahel in Sudan, Senegal, and so forth. And some of the it makes me cry too. Some of the African-American students were just stunned to suddenly realize that far from having their culture destroyed by slavery, in this case, and colonization, that they actually had managed to save and hold on to that connection to their deeper religious heritage. And that was conveyed in the music that had survived for centuries. And, and this is no trivial thing, because if you ask, what is there in American culture that is of world global significance? What can you name? Madonna, Michael Jackson? It's kind of a pointless question. There's very little, maybe some of the political institutions of democracy that developed there, but basically it's a culture which, compared to most cultures around the world, and whether it's Protestant or Catholic or whatever, it's not the sort of things that's easy to convince people that they should adopt in other parts of the world. But the one thing that is universal is all of this musical tradition, the blues, the jazz, all of these things, which are actually rooted in the African-American Sufi tradition that made its way through this new culture and eventually became part of the world. So this kind of borrowing or transmission between one tradition and another is something that we see throughout religious history. I wanted to give a few examples here, both historical and contemporary. By the way, when did we start? We have 1 hour basically for talking, maybe, and an hour for questions. Is that reasonable? I'm looking for the sponsors. Yeah, Okay, but at least an hour I can go ahead and talk. Okay, no, that's fine. But the things that we would take of as being totally part of the Christian tradition, one good example would be the Divine Comedy. It's a comedy, a commedia. It's a divine play of Dante Alighieri, the first great work written in the Italian language. Now, on the one hand, the religious ideas that Dante uses are so close because of common philosophical roots to the learned Islamic philosophical traditions, devotional traditions of that day, that an Egyptian and a Spanish, I think he was cardinal eventually, Spanish cleric named Asin Palacios, actually talked about that Dante might have taken most of his ideas from the traditions of the Miraj and so forth in Islam, and from Ibn Arabi in particular, a great Islamic mystic. But probably the more important thing is that they shared these common theological traditions, which are very much a part of the Catholic tradition of the Middle Ages. But what we don't always realize is that Dante was being quite daring in taking Virgil and Homer's Odyssey. In other words, archetypal pagan works, and using them to portray one of the most influential understandings of the Catholic tradition. And the same things happen again and again in Islam as well. This don't have to be, I'm just kind of focusing here on Muslim, Catholic or Muslim Christian relations. But the next thing I want to say is that in the modern secular world, we're actually surrounded by spiritually important and very useful and very attractive dimensions of spiritual life that we aren't told in church or in the mosque. No one says these are Islamic stories or images. These are Christian stories. In other words, they're just there, and it doesn't help. You know what happens if the TV producer or the filmmaker says, this is a Christian film or this is an Islamic play, means people who are not Christian or Muslim don't go to it. And the people who are say, oh, that's got to be boring. You know, if it's a religious one. Most of you were at that stage at some point in adolescence where everything religious was boring. No? Or at least you had friends who felt that way? No? You know, maybe you didn't, but most of the world, that's the way it works. And it usually you have to get beyond adolescence to begin to appreciate the attractiveness and the necessity for religious teachings and ideas and experiences. And so one I just wanted to take an example of is one of the key dimensions of religious teaching in Islam and in the Qur'an, as well as in Christianity, is what in technical language we call eschatology. It just means the understanding, the logos, the account of what comes after this life, or where we're headed, where we're going. It's the ma'ad in Islamic terms, but what is the afterlife like? Because what we're living for is something that we're going to discover. If we don't discover it in this life, we're going to discover it after we passed away, or when people close to us have passed away. And if you're like, I don't think in all the Christian traditions I know of, and in Catholicism, in Islam, it's hard not to talk about those things because about half the Quran is about them. So you just can't ignore it. But in Christianity, I don't think in Sunday schools or church education programs, there's everybody's well aware of hell, or what they imagine to be hell. But apart from that, there's not very much a clear idea of what paradise is, or what, you know, why that's so important. And also not much idea of what these things mean to people in other traditions. So eschatology is kind of one of those key sides of religion that gets swept under the rug. Now, I'm just giving you this as an example, but in America, a few years ago, for 5 years, there was a television show called The Good Place. And it's a euphemistic phrase in English for talking about heaven as opposed to hell. Now, the premise of the film was that the people are in this beautiful city where they have all these things that they want and desire, and they think they're in the good place, heaven, but in fact, it's a very devious and place in hell. And so as the program unfolds, they discover not only that they're being tested continually, so the place they are becomes an image for how we're tested in this world, in this life, but then they also begin to discover how we learn through consequences of our actions. How we learn through, in religious terms, we call that suffering, and the actions that lead us into suffering, temptations, and so forth. The terminology here and the results very familiar because they're very similar in Islam and in Christianity. So this, I thought, I was gradually discovered that this program, which unfolded over about 5 years, but basically the people who were revisiting this place discover that they try and figure out all the different ideas we have, both conscious and unconscious, about where we're going after this life in terms of paradise and hell. And they learn how, in fact, they learn to consider these images as essential images for learning how to live our life here, how we learn our lessons here in this life. So they learn how to live by experiencing these different kinds of not so happy places that human beings create for each other. And this isn't something that you have to have a particular religious faith in to understand, because we're all familiar with how, on the family level, on the community level, on the political level, how people make life hell for each other. And if you're going to be a priest or a sister, if you're going to be doing confessions, if you're going to be responding to people's confessions, most of what I'm guessing that most of what you're going to hear is either how people have made life educationally a hell for themselves, or that somebody else has made that way for their children, for their people that they're responsible for. As I say, this rule applies at the individual level all the way up to larger social and political issues. So I'm just wanted again to give this as one example of the thousands of ways that modern secular culture, in fact, allows us to learn traditional lessons in a form that speaks in the language of us and our families and our people around us. And this is true whatever country you live in on earth. Another illustration of how we learn from another tradition, in this case, the Islamic tradition, is the perennial and expanding appeal of Jalaluddin Rumi, the famous Sufi poet of Konya, of Turkey, and the ways, one of the things that's interesting about this is that when first people started translating him, people kind of scoffed at how could this be of popular interest? Maybe they're mistranslating Rumi, or they didn't understand what Rumi was saying. Because for years, Rumi's translations, and they weren't very good ones, were the best-selling paperback books in the United States and England. In other words, in English, that poetry became bestsellers and perennial bestsellers again and again. And of course, as a result, more and more of the tradition, not only Rumi's poetry, but Attar's, many of the other classics of the Islamic spiritual poetry began to become part of the larger culture. So that now there are groups that stage the Conference of the Birds of Attar, or that people will read. I don't know how many weddings I've been part of where people use the scripture. Instead of using scripture, they'll use poetry of Rumi as part of the wedding ceremony. Often, very rarely would that be a case when it's a Muslim wedding. Usually it's people from Christian or Jewish backgrounds. But what's really interesting, why should people feel that way about Rumi, even in bad translation? Well, if you read about his life, it's very interesting, because it turns out that he wrote on the frontier, the wild frontier of his day, in which the people surrounding him were Greeks, Greek speakers, Armenians, Franks, that's people from Spain, Italy, and Crusaders and so forth, and Tatars, which is we would call the Mongols and so forth. So that Rumi was writing, he had to find ways to write about spiritual things, not for traditional Arab-trained Muslims, but for human beings who spoke all of those different languages. And so he took his spiritual teachings, he took them from folk tales, things like animal tales that were almost everything you find in the Masnavi or Rumi is taken from the popular culture and wisdom of the day, but not from the Muslim theologians, but actually from things that are familiar to people, just like film, cinema, musical creations are today. Another example of this role of the changing influences of familiar religious scriptures is the way that the Psalms evolved. Again, I assume, I'm not even going to ask because I have to assume that all of you are familiar with at least some of the Psalms, probably read them. Do people here generally read the Psalms in Bahasa Indonesia? Is that the language that you read the Bible in? That's an ignorant question on my part, but assuming that's the case. So are they beautiful in Bahasa Indonesia? Some people are smiling, but no, I'm curious because the Psalms, like Rumi, if they're not well translated, you're going to lose the power they have over people because basically the Psalms express every spiritual experience that we can have of our proximity to God or those times in our life we feel distant with God and we're asking desperately for God's help. So the poetic traditions in Islam are pretty much fulfill that same role of the Psalms. And of course, the Psalms in Judaism had a very different role. When you go back to formative Christianity, the first monastic orders to the early Christians, what were their services like in the house churches that Christianity were basically people reciting and singing the Psalms. And if you see a group of people reciting and singing the Psalms, it looks an awful lot like a Sufi gathering. In other words, I don't mean to offend either group. It's just that that role of communally reciting powerful poetry and scripture in terms of opening up life and transforming it is something that we tend to lose sight of, and yet it's reinvented in the modern world in terms of poetry and music that speaks to people today. Now, what I put up there are another thing that is, I don't know whether you've ever encountered the word mandala. In fact, if I had a piece of chalk or a marker, I could even write up some of these words here. But mandala is a word for a image of a spiritual reality, a spiritual situation in Buddhism. It's particularly common in Tibetan Buddhism. Again, at least in American culture, you know, it's like when people don't want to be seen just as Buddhist, I'm sorry, just as Christian, Muslim, or Jewish in American culture, they want to study spirituality, spiritual practice, and so forth. Almost the alternative that everybody turns to is one or another of the branches of Buddhism. They don't become Buddhists. It's because they want to do a spiritual practice that isn't tied to any particular familiar religious tradition. I don't know, again, please help me out here. Is there anything like this appeal either to openly Buddhist teaching, or it might be Taoist or Confucian in this culture? Does that kind of tradition often have a wide appeal to people who actually could find all the same teachings in their own home tradition, but it's somehow clearer and separate if they could kind of separate it off in terms of Buddhism? Is that a phenomena that some people are smiling? I don't know, or whatever. Come on, Eric, help me out here. I know you've been abroad in Indiana for 7 years, but at least, but is there a thing about going to Buddhist retreats or using Buddhist meditation therapy, focused meditation? Is this kind of thing popular in Indonesia? Well, there, nobody's raising their hand, so I know here from way back. Well, it's just that this idea that I'm talking a lot of ways here, that Muslims have learned from Christians over the ages and vice versa. But in fact, the same thing in the modern world, because people are more and more aware of, I mean, you have the Pancasila. Well, you've got Catholics or Christians and Muslims. But what are the other three? Come on, help me out here. Hindu. Well, I'm just having trouble. Oh, that's three off the bat. And then Hindus, Confucians, or probably that includes Taoist people of Chinese background in any case. But again, this is kind of enshrined in the national ideology. You have a Panjasiva holiday, I think, that's around this time of year and so forth. But in fact, more popular than the smaller religions here is probably these spiritual practices, which are borrowed from Eastern religions, but they don't make you a Taoist or Confucian or whatever, but they're actually just teachings that are practical and helpful, either practically in life or spiritual teachings. So this is something that happens all over the world today, not just in Indonesia, but I don't think you can escape it here. So mandalas are images of our spiritual condition. They're like a mirror in which we can see our spiritual state. These happen to be miniatures, maybe just one or more than one, from, again, Central Asia, and it's built on a mystical poetic tradition. But I say here, this, the important thing is in this painting on the other side, when you watch it, you kind of have to see where are you in terms of the different kinds of love that are portrayed here. And where are maybe people that you know closely. Well, we'll come back to it, but that notice that what's being said there is that love is not higher and lower, but that love informs the purpose and the motivating power of everyone in the world and every creature in the world. Now, in Islamic terms, this is the famous hadith where God says, I was a hidden treasure and I loved to be known. So I created the world. I created creation and human beings, so that I might be known. So this is it. You have God in the center, not God as creator, but God as the manifestation of all the different aspects of the divine reality that we're here in this world to learn, so that we can become images of that love and we can carry that love back to its divine source. So this permeability, I would call it, of spiritual aspects of religion that we've talked about in these different forms is particularly, I just wanted to mention before we come back to the pictures, some of the different forms that we really take for granted, the ways that already Islam has influenced Christianity or vice versa. One of the most obvious of those, and by the way, in most of these cases, they came into the Middle East from Buddhist practice and made their way into Islam and Christianity. One of the most obvious is the rosary and prayer beads. You might think that either they're tasbihs from Muslim tradition or they're the rosary. I don't know this. How many beads do you have in the rosary? I forgot. One. This you have to know. Somebody tell me. No, in the actual Catholic rosary, they use for Hail Mary and all that. It's 33 in a Muslim, right? 33 in the Christian too. No. Oh well, it's probably different. They don't want to copy each other, but the important thing is that when an aspect of one religious tradition is very useful, 59. Okay, so quite different. Thank you, whoever said that. But of course, Protestants didn't really take to this very well, but in Catholic tradition, it's very important and common. And of course, it's important. Why? Because it helps you to, it's a kind of remembrance about a kind of way of focusing your attention on aspects of the divine, in the case of Mary, on the infinite divine mercy, that Mary represents. I can, again, I don't know how widely practiced Marian devotion is in the forms of Catholicism that are noted where you come from, but I can certainly remember my father talking, and he was from a Protestant background, but how there were two things that everybody in World War II, when they were, in this case, he was fine, that they faced death every day. Two aspects of religion that everybody got to know by heart. One was the Psalms, especially the 23rd Psalm. He said there are no atheists in the black souls, there are no atheists. And again, the devotions to Mary, the image of Mary's the image of compassion and support and suffering. So that didn't matter whether you went from a Protestant, came from a Protestant tradition or in fact, in many cases, Muslims who aren't particularly officially devoted to Mary and Miriam. Of course, she's pretty central in the Qur'an and in that tradition. But again, there are many of these examples of religious life and devotion which completely overlap between Islam and Christianity. Another one that I wanted to mention is just the image of the halo, which you're all familiar of, in images of the saints, the holy figures, comes from an image of this divine flame in Buddhist culture, which was taken over in the Islamic culture. It's not in these images, but and again from there. Other things that are similar and carry over from Islamic practice into Christian practice. In a way, these things are obvious. I'm going to talk about pilgrimage and ziyarah and sainthood. But the thing is that Protestants don't have something that corresponds to pilgrimage and I'm not talking about Hajj, about ziyarah, so neighboring, close by holy sites. And so what are we really talking about when we talk about pilgrimage? It's one of these examples that's probably absolutely closest between both Christian and Muslim tradition. I'm sorry. Is there just some water? Okay. But what is really associated with pilgrimage? Again, familiar to you all, and I assume, can I assume that pretty much everybody here had some place of pilgrimage close to where you grew up? You didn't have to go up to Jerusalem or Rome or anything like that, but you know, all around this area of Jakarta, there are these amazing, wonderful Christian devotional sites that go off. I don't know. Where are you about this? Okay. You do this thesis on these things. That's what happened about the ones around here. But there are also, as you well know, there are many Muslim holy sites that pilgrimage, what we're talking here about the process of coming to, you know, devoting yourself to all the learning that takes place during the pilgrimage process. And in the modern world, so what do you get there? You have, in fact, the word is interesting because in the Islamic tradition, what we call tourism today, siyaha, was used in the Middle Ages. Siyaha was a word for religious journeying. There wasn't much tourism at the site, but actually people did all sorts of pilgrimages. And so the word that modern Arabs use to refer to tourism, siyaha, was actually the word used for the religious growth we get through the experience of moving around and practicing and living with other people in different places. So what are we really looking for when we go on pilgrimage, be it Muslim or Christian? One of the obvious is almost all of these places that we're journeying towards is places of natural beauty and the peace that flows from that. When I walked into your particular faculty here, what do you hear? You hear the incredible voice of the birds. It's like an absolute sanctuary. I don't know, you probably take it for granted, especially if you're living right here, but come down to the Sanata Dharma Castle, Sanata Dharma, right? Yeah, the castle, the campus down in the middle of Yogyakarta. What do you hear? Noise, right? I mean, very little of nature. Maybe, I don't know, at 4 in the morning or something like that before the azan, you might hear a little bit of nature of the birds awakening or whatever. But this pilgrimage and the peace that comes with it is something that people literally can't live without for a long time. They'll get crazy. There's too much just mere noise there. So there's natural beauty and peace. There's the spiritual history, sacred history, and the transformations in people's lives that are exemplified by when you're going on a pilgrimage to a site. It's not just that you're celebrating like a historian would at public holidays, something that's particularly important in terms of your community. That's one side of pilgrimage. But more essentially, you're really exploring a possibility of connection at the simplest level and of transformation at a deeper level. And again, whether you're going on a Muslim ziyarah or a Christian pilgrimage, that's why you don't want to do pilgrimage too much. Has anybody ever tried what happens often at first? Like a pilgrimage experience. Oh, that was amazing. It was life transforming. I've got to do that again. No. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, but I was saying what often happens, especially if you come from a Christian tradition or Muslim one where they don't do ziyarah very much, when people do it, usually they come back and they feel they've changed, their life has changed. It doesn't really matter. I think the only sort of obvious example is Lourdes in France. You know, people go there to get cured, but usually people come back with a lot more spiritual rewards than simple healing or something you can simply, but people come back changed. They take their spiritual dimension of the reality more seriously. And as a result, sometimes people can become kind of addicted to that experience. Maybe that's not a problem here, but again, having spent quite a few years in France teaching and all, I can see that happening all around me. So the next thing is, as far as sacred sites, often they're places that are well, if it's a holy person, usually it's one of two things. It's either associated with their death or martyrdom, in the case of the first Christian saints, or with their sites where they were born, their birthplaces, and sometimes sites where they were most active. But again, the sites are very important. And what's interesting is that in Western cultures, at least, where you don't have Catholic and Muslim forms of pilgrimage, that people's lives are pretty much, their lives when they're not working are pretty much built around secular equivalents of those pilgrimages. They don't call it that, they call it tourism. But when I was growing up, whenever we wanted to have vacation time, we'd go to sacred places in nature. At the time, they called them national parks. If you look at a map of Java, it's covered with national parks. So I haven't benefited from them, but I sure hope to one day to get to visit all these wonderful national parks. But what are you going there to experience? You're going there to experience, again, this peace of the divine presence that is manifest in primordial nature. And not just of the divine peaceful presence, but in some sense that getting close to what Islam is called the Jalal, the divine majesty, the divine power, which transcends anything that we can know in our everyday life. And so again, it carries us into the deeper awareness of God's presence in our lives and in the world. As far as sites, they weren't also sites of sacred people that people do in the modern version, but they're always sites of political pilgrimage, of heroes, of conversion experiences, birthplace, graves, and all, of political founders or of people who founded movies or particular sect that you belong to. And finally, when it comes to examples of self-sacrifice, courage, devotion, today we often find people substitute sports pilgrimages. One of the most obvious examples we've just gone through was the Olympics almost the same time as the Pope's visit to Indonesia? Anybody remember? Are the Olympics a big event here, like on TV all the time? You can't get away from them? No. One of the things I find interesting about the Olympics on the TV coverage is that each family of the people who are the heroes of our culture, they actually are like hagiographies. Does the word hagiography clear? Like with a saint, it's a holy figure in Islam. Usually it means their lives. Stories are accounts of the saints, and stories are accounts of their spiritual virtues, the discipline they went through, the ways their family supported them, and all. So it's basically a religious theme, a religious practice that has made its way into secular culture. That is the modern day equivalent of hagiographies of saints' lives and saints' devotional figures, both in Islam and Christianity. Let's see, I was just going to say anything else here. Yeah, so I think that's enough examples of the title, shared challenges of communication, and not so much just the challenges, but the ways that human beings today, sometimes what we talked about leads to their rediscovery of the deeper dimensions of their own Muslim or Christian tradition. But in any ways, in any respect, it's the ways that people adapt classical religious forms to modern day contemporary practice. And we can go on and give lots of examples, but perhaps I'll just help you to, these few remarks will help you to see how, instead of thinking we live in a secular society, that we live in what are always sacred societies, but we have to work a little harder to see what the divine presence is, the ways that it's expressing itself and its demands on us and its rewards in a society where we have to learn about new ways to approach God, new ways to do God's will. I could go on and on, but that's enough. If I had time here, if I ran out of time, but I think we've taken the hour, right? Basically. Maybe I can just say a little bit more. I'm going to go to this one that's exactly the same image, but I just wanted, well, yeah, I think this is the kind of painting that you should have next to your bed, or, you know, they're clearly Christian equivalents, but that it's endlessly exhaustive in showing us that instead of thinking that people have incompatible and even hostile points of view and things that they devote their lives to, is you can see that actually each one of these loves and lovers around the edge is a different way of approaching God, a different way of being aware of God's love and responding to it. It takes us a little deeper into areas when it comes to the animals and their relationships to each other. It's a dimension that of life that neither contemporary Christianity nor contemporary Islam are particularly interested in, by and large, and yet people, humans, kids, old people, or whatever, are very interested in what we can learn from the animals around us, both in nature and in pets and so forth. So all of these different kinds of loves are around there. And then what the picture suggests is that the people who we call prophets, saints, images of God, those who are close to God, the apostles, the disciples, and so forth, that they are the figures that together are the ways that we become aware of God's presence in our lives. I mean, everybody, Christian tradition, Muslim tradition, we're all aware of the different ways we're told to remember, that we're told to be aware of the divine presence in our lives. But what makes that discipline, that lesson real, is meeting the people who are living that, meeting the people who exemplify that closeness. And I suggest that the patriarchs and the other figures in the center of that painting, it's no accident they're not gods on earth, but they are the images of God that bring the divine qualities and the love that are sparked by and attracted by those divine qualities into our lives. And so when you watch a painting like this, it's not just you're studying something historical about the ways that Persians in the 14th century or whatever envisioned this question of divine love. What it's really asking us to do is, where am I here? Where are the people I know here? And in the center, who are the people who are the saints, the Islam, the awliya, those who are close to God? Who are those people, not historically and as people tell you, but who are they in the lives that we live? And since most of you are destined to religious vocations, you've probably already made your choice in that regard. Notice that you have the choice of being one of those figures of examples and devotion and all the different spiritual virtues, which aren't that different in Islam and Christianity. You have that choice of just treating that vocation as another job, or instead treating it as a gateway for other people, the people you work with, whether it's a teacher or a priest or a meditator, that they are the people, you are going to be the people in the center, that entails, well, endless responsibilities, but endless rewards. Okay, thank you. So time for questions.
Thank you so much for Professor Morris for your insightful presentation, for your sharing. We truly appreciate your depth knowledge and for your sharing today. Now we'll begin our discussion, question and answer. To ensure everybody runs smoothly to this discussion, I will lead the discussion. And if you have a question, please raise your hands and first introduce yourself and then the question. Okay? Is there anybody?
Okay, thank you. Good evening to all of you, especially for Professor. My question is there general or universal understanding about mysticism in all? What is there universal or general understanding about mysticism among all religions? And the second one, what is the goal of mysticism? Because when I read Buddhism, Islam, and Christianity, I faced any confused. Because in
There seem to
Islam
be many
and
goals.
Islam
Many
and
goals. You're confused because there seem to be many goals. Sometimes
Yeah.
it's quietude of the spirit, sometimes it's devotion, sometimes
Yes.
it's ecstasy. And everybody has those different confusing ideas about what's the goal, not just of mysticism, but of spiritual life and practice. I'm putting words in your mouth, but just accelerate the process. Is that
may I continue my
summarize what you're asking?
question? May I
Continue.
finish
yeah.
my question? Okay.
Yeah. That's already.
And the
one of the
third-
questions. Okay.
And the third question is God the goal of mysticism? Because when I read Buddhism, Islamic Christianity, in Islam and Christianity, they have their own concept of God, but God. But in Buddhism, they have no concept God.
Yeah.
How about that?
So three
I
questions.
face any yes
Yes.
confused about
Okay.
it. Thank you.
First of all, I don't think it's particularly helpful to use the word mysticism if by that you understand there's only certain people who are mystics and other people who are not. Because in all of these traditions, the ideal of spiritual growth, perfection is something that's seen as it doesn't matter whether you're a lay person or a clerical person or somebody who's devoted to spiritual life. Each of those activities, again, whether it's even in Buddhism, each of those activities is designed to bring us closer to what you could call our perfection, our completion as human beings. And one of the things that happens in some of the traditions, that, by the way, it happens in Buddhist traditions as well, is that people understand what was presented as an ideal figure of perfection. In Buddhism, they call these bodhisattvas. So let's not talk about Christianity, Islam right now. But the bodhisattvas, often the statues that where I grew up, and that people think, oh, these are statues of the Buddha, was not Shakyamuni, the historical, if you will, founder of Buddhism, but it's figures who represent the different kinds of perfection that human beings are capable of, which may lead beyond this world into other worlds. That those figures are figures. What happens is often people turn figures of devotion into idols. And how do we, like if you grew up in a Protestant world like I did, people see Buddhas, they think that the Buddha statues are idols. Right? I mean, people, there are all these stories about Mahmud of Ghazni going to India when he conquers India, destroying the idol temples, and so forth. A lot of the missionaries from the West who came to the Eastern world, whenever they saw images, Buddhas or lots of similar things in Japan, Korea, China, they would want to destroy those because they thought they were idols. So to come back to your question, who or what are the idols that, you don't see pictures really of any of these people in love with, they're not in love with idols. There's no idol, because what's in the center there is not some divine beloved, but it's rather the divine love that we find through all of the different forms of love that we have. So when mystics in Islam want to get beyond the notion of this person is an exemplar of God and this person is not, instead they'll talk about the Asma'ul Husna, the divine names or divine qualities. And I don't know what exactly the Christian equivalent would be, but certainly when you read guides to spiritual practice by famous saints and so forth in Christianity, there's an emphasis on, let me take St. Teresa of Avila as an example. There's an example, because by the way, if you haven't read the autobiography of St. Teresa of Avila and the Spiritual Mansions, these are going to be some of the transformative readings that you'll have in life. I've taught them to people. It doesn't matter, again, whether the people reading them, what their religion is, because Teresa of Avila has this gift of discovering the truth inside the idols. Rather than destroying the idols, she leads us back to discover in the reality and presence of Jesus Christ. Am I speaking the language that people know here? That is something that we are aware of sometimes and we lose sight of. So her writings are all designed to bring us back towards that awareness of not of an idolized Jesus, but a Jesus that's here. And I'll tell you a story about this question of idolatry and Christianity, Islam being so personality oriented. I had because you learn from kids. Well, my youngest son, his name is Jacob Samuel. And one day when he was about 4 years old, I was explaining to him that his middle name, Samuel, means Shami Allah, that he listens to God. And he looked at me very seriously and he said, I don't listen, I communicate. He hit his heart here with each syllable of communicate. So God, for him, was not the idol, the statue. God was the reality that is communicating with his heart. I wish he'd stayed so smart. It's really read as a parent. This was when he was 4 years old. But that notion of moving from what holy creatures and things that are said to be divine words and in whatever languages they are, scriptures and so forth. So moving from the idolatry of the letter or the idolatry of the person to the deeper reality of God that's expressed in each of these forms of manifestations of God. That's not something that ever stops. That's something that we have to. So when somebody wants to say, I know God in this form, they're telling the truth. But when they say, I know God in this form, but no other forms are true, where does that come from? That very often, it would be like somebody, say couples, couple relationships. You can say, I'm trying to think of the idea, but Jane loves John or John loves Jane. The equivalent would be to say, well, now I found the person that I love. So that means I don't love all the other people that I love in life and that I mean things to and they mean things to me. So this transformation of love as we experience it to a kind of idolized or closed off love is we're always in the position where we can either become idolaters, and this is a language that's generally used by spiritual writers in both traditions. We can be idolaters in the one sense, or we can become vessels. And usually those vessels are kind of people that their ego has been broken by, and so that they can actually be vessels for the love that each person around them feels. And those people in the end, they tend to call them saints, bodhisattvas, figures of divine love. And the question, another part of your question is it hard to find people who manifest what Jesus is talking about? And doesn't everybody here worry about that at some point? Like, am I missing out? My friend has this real spiritual connection and I don't have that connection. And how do you deal with that? I'll put your question back to you. When you think that you are missing out on God's love and presence and so forth. Well, I would just suggest, quietly, that we have the choice with people who we can listen to them and discover what they're teaching us about God's presence. In Christianity, you have the advantage of the Trinity. So you have all these different ways we can encounter God, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. But in a way, you can look at Islam. Basically, it's all about the Holy Spirit. So each person that we encounter, is what this is saying, or each point at which we encounter God in nature or in our relationships with nature and with other things, those are starting points in destroying the idolatry that we naturally tend towards. Your question is so serious. I'm sorry. I hope people don't resent taking so much time on it, because first of all, it's 3 questions, not 1, and they're all absolutely important, because we don't, like in a catechism or in with the sheikh in Islam, or you're doing devotional practices, we tend to just do the practice without raising the kinds of questions that you're asking. So one of the big forms of idolatry in each religion is idolatrizing the practice. Just, I've got to do this. If I say all this many Hail Marys, these many Our Fathers, or say the 3 names of God 33 times after prayers, in Islam, all these things, that we sort of believe that will get us closer to the central state there, that love. But how do we really find out that love? I mean, how? I'm asking this question of everyone, but chances are that there are a couple of things. One is we find it in the natural world, that it's hard to be out in primordial nature and not feel the presence of God all around us. What we do with that, that's up to us. Another one is people who have the role of mentors. I can't say it could be a priest. It can be a person who is long dead, but we know them through their writings or through visitation to their shrine. But we have to disguise people. We have to encounter people and value their encounters with people who are, for us, mirrors of God. There's different languages for that. We might call them saintly figures in Christian traditions. I call them the awliya Allah, those who are near to God in the Muslim tradition. But one of the things you grow up with, and I'm as much a part of that anyway, let me give you an illustration. But when I first started traveling, I didn't get this from books, but I would go to people's spiritual gatherings, Sufi groups or whatever, or I would go and be taken by friends to places or teachers who were kind of considered to be holy men or holy women. And at first I felt I'm very out of place because I don't belong to whatever religion that was that holy person was or whatever. But quickly, I think you just have to do it a few times, and you discover that literally that God is there, present, and speaking to us in whatever situation we find ourselves. Now, what's a lot harder is when we're in the situation of the people with the fighting over there in the backside, you know, on the right side, the what look like the jalal of God, God's horrors that people inflict on each other, whatever. But when you think about it, in your own life, which kind of experience is more likely to stay with you all your life? Discovering God when you are desperate and needy and you're not worried any longer about the form? Or is it the things when you discover God because you really had a great pilgrimage and all went well and grace was everywhere around you? Well, chances are for most of us, it's the point where our human abilities no longer got us there. And so God had to come and touch us and rescue us and show us the light and the direction. So in the Psalm, the Quran says, "Aynama tuwallu thamma wajhullah." Wherever you turn in the Quran, wherever you turn, whether it be towards, well, actually it begins, God's are the places of darkening and the places of lighting. And it says, wherever you turn around, those are the face of God, or there is the face of God. Well, what makes you turn around? Because it's usually not translated properly. What makes us turn around? The suffering, the longing, the sense of nostalgia for something that's deeper than we experience. So wherever we turn around, that's why, after all, what do I see some of the people who could be religious out there? What do people do? It doesn't matter. It's just we're in a Christian audience, we'll say it. What do you do to help people in that turning around? One of the most obvious things is medicine, hospitals, caring, mental illness, psychology, you know, all the things that priests and sisters have to do in order to help people make that turnaround. So you become, in doing that, you become those figures in the center who are the face of God that people need to turn towards. So it's not hard. You know? It's just hard to say. We tend to think that God's really, there's a lot of Sufi poetry I could cite in this thing, but that God seems so far away. And the Hafez says, for years my heart was seeking Jamajan, the presence of God, Jamajan Talabikar. And that which my heart itself had, I was seeking from the people who are wandering along the shores. And so we're all like that. I mean, the fact that you're here probably means that you've been sought out. You've been chosen to help other people follow all of these endless different resources and vehicles that are there to awaken people to God's presence. And that's a great honor, it's a great gift, and it's a great responsibility. I'm probably sounding like a recruiter for a seminary, but anyway, and the only difference in Islam is that you kind of have to do this in real life. You can't just, you can't just be among people who are devoted to that, but your responsibility is to make that real, again, everything, whatever you're doing in life, but it doesn't really matter. It's the same responsibility. Okay. Thanks for questions like that. I'll remember it to the end of my life because you really put the essence in your questions. So,
Thank you, Professor.
Experience.
yeah, what?
So it means mysticism is very personal experience, love experience with a person and God.
Or a place, or I mean, wherever you turn, there's the face of God. So, what the deeper question is, why and what makes us think that we're not close to God? And that's really real. You're talking about mental illness, suicide, all of the people that feel that they're distant, really distant from God, whether they put it in that language or not. But what you have to know is that where you see that, that's what the parable of the Good Samaritan, where you see that suffering, you've got the choice of responding to it, and both Islam, there are plenty of verses with Islam and the Bible. Wherever you see that suffering, you respond to it. You will find God there. You know, in some ways, you could, you know your Bible, Matthew 24. Sorry if I was sick and you didn't visit me. I was hungry and you didn't. The same thing is in one of the divine sayings of hadith Qudsi in Islam. And notice there are two sides to that. Whether in the Islam, it's like I was sick and you didn't visit me. If you had, you would have found me with the sick person. So it's just a little bit more not monotheistic. But what's interesting is that people that I teach can usually see that we're being asked to respond to the sickness. The verse, scripture verse, is one of the spiritual. You know, we're being asked to do that. But what people don't see, whether it be Matthew 24 or the Hadith Qudsi in Islam, is that it's through being the hungry person, the sick person, the thirsty person, and not having people respond. What do we learn from that situation? We learn empathy, compassion. You know, you can't will yourself into compassion in life. You know, you have to discover compassion through the suffering that we have. And when we've discovered that compassion, then we can be instruments of God's will. But actually, when we're suffering, when we're failing to live out that injunction of Christ in chapter 24 or of Matthew or in the Hadith Qudsi, when we're failing to do that, we're also doing God's will. It just doesn't look like it because we imagine ourselves as spiritual superstars, but actually spiritual learners, which is what we're doing when we're suffering, when we don't see our way out. And this is why hagiographies and stories of different spiritual personalities in Christianity and Islam are so important, because it turns out that, you know, the most famous ones are usually the ones who had the most difficult life. I'm thinking of, for example, John of the Cross or St. Teresa of Avila. These are, you know, they're doctors of the church. They're superstars. You see their statues. Or in Islam, you see the same awliya and famous Sufis and all. But when you look at their lives and what they went through, nobody would trade the life we have for their life, you know, because it just looks too hard, you know. So does that help? I can see this dawning. You know? Yeah, I just love this as a teacher. I just love it when people open up and ask the central questions like you have there, because it isn't that I know anything. It's just that you don't know it, and then you say you actually. When somebody raises the question, that's when you realize that you've been given a kind of light on it that you can share. And most of you are going to have to do that if you're a priest, if you're in a religious vocation. You're going to be called upon again and again to be that light for other people. And what greater vocation could you have, you know? And my apologies, the priest here did not put me up to this. If I sound like another priest, that's just accidental. Okay, I just try to be a good Sufi, if you will, or whatever. But they're going to end up sounding a lot like. You just can't. You know, don't worry about the labels. It's the love that counts. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, there's another question. You may ask the question in Indonesia, and Father Heru will help us to translate the question for you.
Yes.
Raise your hand. Brother Jerry.
Okay, thank you so much, dear professors. Maybe this topic already taught by you about the topic in use of music in Sufist practices. My question is, what are the theological and philosophical underpinning of the use of music in Sufi practices, and how do they relate to the broader Islamic understanding of the relationship between the sacred and the secular?
Can we take those separately? Because I mean, the first one was very clear to me. I didn't. I sort of
The
didn't
first
think
about the aspect of
music, yeah.
theological and philosophical underpinning of the use of music, Sufis practices music?
Well, again, I own, this isn't a theological answer, a philosophical answer. It's simply a practical one, is that the relevance of sound to our perception of the divine is that when you think about it, it bypasses our intellect. That just like you could say in love, you could say to somebody, I love you, but I'm not going to go near you or touch you or have anything to do with you, but I really love you. You know, it works a little better if you kind of interact with that person more directly. And the important thing about, because what are the scriptures? The scriptures are words, sacred words that have their own power in the recitation. Doesn't matter what tradition, Buddhist, Christian, Jewish, or whatever. So the vicar starts with the recitation of the divine word, but that the power of that is sometimes amplified if we see it in a particular place, or if we amplify it by using a particular instrument. So look, music is such a general term. Music today applies to all sorts of satanic crap, you know. Let's face it. I'm not talking about music generically, but spiritual music, the remembrance of God. And that there's a beautiful ayah in the Quran that says, "Ala bi dhikrillahi tatma'innul qulub." Is it not through the remembrance, the recitation of God, that the hearts find their peace? So you can tell when something is spiritual, music, whatever, if the hearts find in that their peace. And that's going to be different in different cultures for different personalities. Again, music has an awful big form in Christian worship, big role in Christian worship, as well as in Sufism and Islam. And part of that is that what works in one culture, what transforms people's lives, it's going to be different in another culture. And so there's no point in forming judgments about it because you like one thing and you don't like another, or your culture says you can do dhikr with a tambourine or a drum, but you can't do it with a musical instrument, or you can do it, you can't use instruments, you can just recite, things like that. It isn't the Quran doesn't answer that question. The Bible doesn't. The Bible just shows people using these different forms of musical expression, and likewise with the hadith and all. So don't worry about what other people say. Worry about what actually moves people's hearts. And if your heart is not, this is azan out there, but if your heart is not given peace, then something's wrong. And actually, this isn't any accident. I remember getting off the plane in Marrakesh the first time I went to a Muslim country, and hearing the azan. I wasn't quite sure what it was about it, and I'll never forget that moment, because the azan, of course, it's music, it's musical, but it somehow captures something very deep within people, whatever the religion might be. So that's just one illustration. So I'm not giving you a fatwa in response to your question. I'm just saying another part of that is just that people who happen to be Muslim or Taoist or whatever, if they go into a particularly powerful church music situation, they're going to have that spiritual experience. For some people, it's going to be like, say, gospel music, and it's like African American music. For other people, it's going to be organ and Bach and so forth. And likewise with people from Christian and other traditions going to zikr, it's going to be different. And what appeals to them and what touches them is going to be different. And that's, we're different. We're put together differently. So music is, but above all, music is directly to the heart. And that's very important, because some people's speech is directly to the heart. If you ever just sit down and some people's gaze, there are people who are so close to God and they don't know it usually, but you sit there, you see them, you look in their eyes and your eyes, yes, God is real. Here's God, just through the eyes, So each of these things can turn into a technique, into a ritual. But what makes the ritual real is that divine presence that we discover through the zikr, through the gaze, through, for other people in the Bible. What does David do? He dances, I mean, generally when we encounter one of those people up there, we do kind of dance, there's no light. Everything that weighed you down in this world lifts off. Okay. So there's a lady here who asked the question too. So go ahead, but we don't want to forget her. She had her hand up before all of you. So no, go ahead.
Ladies.
Well, now, but why George?
Thank you, Professor. Before this class, I have a question and it has been answered. How does Sufism view other religious perspectives? From your explanation, I understand that Sufism also respect every type of religion so that the dynamic of life will be beautiful and perfect to live. Then my second question is, how are women regarded in Sufism? Thank you.
Okay. I was having trouble. Could you say simply, directly, what she was asking the first question?
Oh, okay. Then my okay. My question is, how are women regarded in Sufism? Yeah. My first question is, how does Sufism view others' religious perspectives?
Yeah. Well, let me just take that first question. How women regarded I think whether it be the stories in the Qur'an or in the Bible, have any trouble remembering stories about women? Forget about people in a particular Muslim culture. They're going to have their different things. Let's start with the scriptures. Who comes to your mind when you think of central women figures in the Quran, or for that matter, in the Bible, the New Testament? All right. That's what saving Islam. So if somebody wants to tell you that there's the other thing, another way of putting that is in the Bible and in the Quran, do you have any trouble in thinking of evil characters? Haman, who's the Karun, Cain, right? Do you think, can you find evil women in the Quran and the Bible? Well, there's Jezebel, things, but I mean, there's a bit of confusion around Eve, certainly, and that's to my feeling, that's the fault of St. Augustine in his interpretations of Genesis. Not something we find so much in the Quran or in Orthodox Christianity, but the whole notion that Eve is somehow responsible for giving him the temptation, all that. It's really St. Augustine who turns that into a theological foundation of certain principles. So I think that first question is, nowadays I'm old enough to remember when it was very strange if a woman was leading prayer or reciting the Quran These were things that only happened among groups of women, but not in congregations, Sufi groups and things like that. Now I would be considered a kind of bum idiot if I said women couldn't do these things. But I've seen it go from a kind of prohibition of women taking on these roles to something that's taken for granted pretty much in different parts of the world. Let me just give another example. The Madlavi Sama, people are doing the turning. It's a kind of devotion that's particular to the Madlavi order. Sort of like invitation. Well, when I started out, the first time I saw them, it was only men. Now you go to Turkey or wherever you go, or other Sufi orders, it's often all women. So these are cultural rules that different cultures fall into. I can only talk about my experience, and I'm so in terms of what I talk about, women usually have no trouble with it. And men have to, what men ask for is a philosophical explanation. And people in religion ask for philosophical explanations. Usually that means they're skeptical or they're not really getting the point. And so it's easier to teach women. Are you getting that? It's my experience. By the way, just to finish up, who are the teachers that men or women are most willing to listen to and get to? By and large, when it comes to spiritual matters, people always go to the person they think can give you the right spiritual answer. And this, experience of that is women who are shakers, they're much more honest and direct than men are. Men are trying to curry your favor, shapes, whatever it could be. And my experience again has been that whenever I could go to a Sufi woman shape, I would get the answer I didn't want. The hard answer. I mean, I hope other people can see it. I just remember one time, it was very marking to me. I went to the Sheikh, and I was in Iran. Everybody did poetry. I read it, I learned from it. I said, well, is it okay for me to write poetry? Okay. You may need to translate for it, whatever. But her answer, I'll never forget. She was Kurdish, but she gave an answer in Persian. Her answer was, poetry's fine, but not to impress girls. Okay, so it took me 25 years to appreciate the lessons she was giving to me then. I thought she misunderstood my question, but she understood what was beneath my question in terms of my nafs and my character and so forth. And so that's my feeling about women as spiritual teachers, is that if I mention Saint Teresa about it, that's not accidental. It's because, and by the way, Saint Teresa of Avila, of Lisieux, is the little flower. She's even more simple, more direct, than Teresa of Avila, who's a genius in terms of spiritual philosophical explanations. Okay, I think somebody back here got we interrupted him. Thank you. Those were good answers. Good questions.
I want to continue about the tradition of music with Sufis music. There is a belief in some Islamic group that music is haram. What is your opinion about these groups? They believe that music is haram for Islam.
There's no scriptural, support for that. In other words, no, it's a more important question you raised there, is because I get it all the time in classes in religion. What matters for people's understanding of religion is whatever they've heard as young kids. It's very hard to get past what you're told when you're a little kid, because you kind of have a faith in people who are religious authorities and so forth. And there's so many things. I'm not going to pick on any one religion. There's so many things in Islam, as there are in Christianity, which are simply, what does the Arabic to say, Kila would call, it was said, it's not, it's not the sort of thing that you can justify in scriptural terms. So, for example, there are certain parts of the Muslim world where Christians or Muslims in there will treat women as a kind of special temptation or fitna. And indeed, in a lot of Western Christian theology, I would say, that role is given to Eve, Hawa. And so it's not that the scripture says that, but if I ask my students in the class, atheists, Christians, Muslims, and all, to read the book of Genesis, 99 times out of 100, they'll read it as a story of Eve's temptation and weakness. So they'll see Eve as this kind of source of sin. And so, by the way, that's less a Muslim thing than it is a Christian thing. But again, in every tradition, interpretations take on the force of scripture. And the question then is, what wakes, I was just mentioning about how the position of women in terms of leading prayer and reciting the Qur'an in public and so forth, how much that's changed in different countries. And in some countries it hasn't changed. But it isn't the scriptures that have changed, it's the interpretations that people give of it. And you're going to be teaching people, forget about people who are enemies of Catholicism from outside. The worst kind of enemies you can find in any religious tradition are the ones from inside. The ones who are going to say, why should I be Catholic? I mean, this and this and this happened, I don't even want to mention, like, just to say, like, I happen to be in Boston. It's a place where a lot of these abusive priests were going to caught and so forth. We have a country like Ireland where there was so much that people thought was good Catholic stuff that now practically everybody in the country calls himself an atheist. Well, the religion didn't change, it's just that people react. I'm sorry if maybe I'm speaking too quickly, but there's a wonderful film called Calvary, an Irish film, which talks about, it doesn't take political stance. It just shows you a Christ-like priest who's up against dealing with all the misunderstandings of Catholicism and religion that have taken over Ireland in the last 20 or 30 years, probably with good reason. But it often takes, it's not that the change here comes from Westernization, from secularization, or whatever. The change comes from people's developing a larger perspective on the meaning of the religion. So it's no longer, this is a good Catholic thing, this is a bad Catholic thing, this is a good Muslim thing, this is a bad Muslim thing. So when people can begin to make those judgments for themselves, it's not a question of book learning education. It's a question of spiritual intelligence. Everybody has the potential for spiritual intelligence, but they have to discover it in practice, usually with someone else setting the example. And then they can say, oh, you mean just because people said this was okay, doesn't mean that it is okay, you know? And I don't know, every religion, every time, there's some of these bad apples that give the religion a bad name. And just be careful which culture you're in, you know, because, well, because the places where you get yourself stoned, you know, so you do have to be careful. Response. You have a.
Yeah, I just want to have another question, but maybe this one is out of the context, but I think for us here in Indonesia, the question about the intermingling between religion and secularization is not quite popular in Indonesia, but in Western society, maybe the question about New Age and how do the New Age movement and also new religious
How do what?
New Age movement?
Well, what about them?
The New Age religions, I mean, do you,
What about them? I mean,
yeah, how do the New Age movement grow up in US, and how do they relate it with the question about spirituality but without religion? Spirituality without religion.
well, actually, I alluded to that some ways here. I don't, first of all, I don't think they're new. I think at every age, you have people who want to simplify religious teaching in such a way that very little thought or practice goes into it. That may not be the primary motive, but in every age, there are people who want to do that. Sometimes they form sects, S-E-C-T-S, and actually with easy answers. And many of those sects become important religious groups or communities. So on the other hand, people learn from their experience. So by and large, one of two things happens. Either the movement that seems new turns out to be, people go into it and they become deeper and deeper in their roots of it. Let me just give you an example, because I taught everywhere. I've taught primarily religious studies environment. And I remember I had a Hare Krishna, a student in one of my classes who grew up in the Hare Krishna Center in West Virginia in the United States. And he was one of the deepest people understanding of Rumi, anyone I've ever met. And he would be in his backpack, he would have these little paperbacks of Rumi's teachings. And he would go around passing those out to people whenever he was traveling in a bus or a train or something. So he was a Sufi missionary, even though he came from this strange group, which made sense in parts of India, but which is hard to explain why Krishna becomes the divine figure, you know, and everything. So that you always have to ask, how are people going to grow from whatever practice it is that they're caught up in? Sometimes they grow through rejecting it. Sometimes they grow through deepening it. And this, you know, America is kind of unusual in the sense that there's so many, the whole history has been, you know, like the Puritans were persecuted in Holland and England, so they came there. So there are all these groups that were considered New Age sects, if you will. In Europe, they came there and set up their communities all, and now they're considered mainstream, you know, Christian Protestant groups. And then in every generation, there have always been new, think of groups like the Christian Zionists or the Mormons. Are these Christians? Or are they not? Well, at least for Americans, they're Christians. You know, I mean, from the point of view of the Catholic Church, I doubt if there's a lot of problems with accepting that as Christian doctrine. But you can also see that as they enlarge the area of Christ's influence to people who might not have been touched by that spiritual light otherwise. And both things can be true. If you're broad-minded enough, you can say it's better that you discover the Quran or you discover the Bible through these particular offshoots, because most of what we now take as mainstream religions was once considered a sect. You know, I mean, the first Christians were all considered heretics by the Jews. You know, it's just known. You know, and yet they turned into something that probably transcends the Judaism of most of the people who were its first critics. So one needs to see how God is working in these situations. That's my remark. Even the horrors of the world, we want to see how God is working through those things. You're looking skeptical here.
Differentiation of such conceptualization, right? Between in Indonesia, for example, and in the Western world, they have like experienced different transformation, modernism, postmodernism, blah blah blah, and then in fact secularism, the idea of so they experience this kind of transformation. Well, we are in Indonesia, we don't have this kind of like a very radical transformation. We don't have never experienced such a radical transformation, right? So, yeah, exactly. So far it's only about concept. So
Yeah.
we don't really see any differentiation.
What?
So it's difficult for us to understand when we come to problem of secularization and religion. We don't have such an idea about secularization. In fact, right? Only concept.
Let me just say something I think will answer both of your questions and comments. If anytime we encounter someone who seems to be either hostile towards us or very strangely involved in some religion, the 99 times out of 10, what will cure that misunderstanding is if we actually talk to the person involved. You know, so much of our what we call religious conflict and all comes from people forming their own arbitrary ideas about what the opposing party is and has. And I think not just now, but throughout history, that can lead to religious wars, to all sorts of horrors. If instead of looking at that image of God in that particular person and letting them respond to us, and because the response is always a dialogue, because they don't know where we're coming from. I mean, so we're always in religious conflict. We're always on both sides of some issue. And that's why people use the word dialogue, because the only way to overcome that kind of conflict is for both parties to talk. Well, dialogue is about two-way talking, but it's really about two-way listening. We just don't have a nice English word to talk about dial listening. But that's, and by the way, a lot of these things you can learn about through being part of a couple. I shouldn't be saying this in a seminary, but a lot of these pointless conflicts. My wife's a psychologist, and often, usually it's either with couples are having trouble or divorcing couples, and the kids are having big trouble by their parents' divorce. And so either people are willing to have a dialogue, and usually things are resolved, but if you can't get people to talk to each other, they talk towards the image that it's like the other person is not wearing a mask, but the person who hates them or questions them has a mask over their face, so they can't see the face that's in front of them. So that's whatever it is we think we hate in the world is very often a mask that's a projection of our fears, our upsets, the traumas that we've actually experienced, and that we're afraid that they're going to repeat themselves for someone else, if not for ourselves. But the only cure for that is, to the degree that you have the power and strength in you, is to listen to the other person. And that's why when my son said, I don't listen to God, he says, I communicate because he's gotten beyond listening of what the Bible or Quran says, but now he's got the Holy Spirit here that he could communicate. The funny thing about I talk to a group like this is religious life is all life, and if you could just get that, then you're learning all the time. And so wherever God places you, this is the place you're supposed to be learning.
Okay, again, I will say thank you for a lot of your sharing. Thank you for all of us in here who have participated in this seminar. And if I may conclude, and if I'm not mistaken, Sufism in Islam, the shared challenge and communication for Islam in the contemporary world in the multifaceted, involving both internal and external dynamics. The arts explain to us, if I'm not mistaken, there's a lot of ways to reach God. And externally, the widespread misconception of stereotype about Islam combined with the often misunderstood nature of Sufism require both to actively engage the meaningful dialogue and broader global audience. From we saw that Sufism have faced a lot of amidst varying interpretation of faiths. There is Christian and there is Buddhism and others. And at last, we would like to ask for Father Bagus to come forward to give some souvenirs and memento to the professor.